7.8 open here, and I'm going to turn off FileZilla. I don't need that right now. And the first thing I want to do is change the Blender render to Blender cycles, because that's like in Maya, that's like Mental Ray versus Maya software render. And it just, if you want anything that looks more realistic, it does a lot better. And I'm more familiar with the nodes for setting up its shaders and everything. It's just better, and it keeps getting faster and faster. It's slightly slower than Blender render, but it's more versatile. And so I'm going to get rid of my lights. So when you're working with Blender, remember to select things in the 3D view here, you have to right-click them to select them, and then you left-click to move things around. And I'm just going to use shortcuts and so forth as I move forward. I'm going to delete this light. So I right-click it, then I hit X, and then I choose delete. I'm going to hit Shift-C, so I recenter my view as well as my 3D cursor. Your 3D cursor is this little guy right here, and whenever you create something, that's where it's going to go. You can also use it to designate other points in space and time. Not time, but in space. So I'm going to hit Shift-C so that it goes into the center. Then I want to add a plane. And you've got several ways of adding objects, primitive objects, but I'm going to come over here to the Create tab. I'm moving quick, but don't remember I'm recording this. So Create, and I'm going to create a plane. So I just hit plane, and it creates it right where my 3D cursor was. I'm going to zoom out, and remember, you zoom out with the mouse wheel, and you can use the turntabling by using the middle mouse button, just pushing it down, you can spin around, and then zooming in, zooming out. And then if you ever get lost, so if I get completely lost and I can't find my object, I just hit the period key on the number pad, and because the plane is selected, this is my outliner, it jumps to where that is. Shortcuts only work based on where your mouse is. So if I hit the shortcut key right here, period, nothing happens. But if my mouse is hovering over here and I hit it, it jumps in. I told you to go away. Close, close. So what I want to do now is scale up that plane. So I'm going to hit the S key and scale up that plane. The funny thing about scale in Blender is if I hit the S key while my mouse is out here, S for scale, you'll see that it moves very slowly. I hit escape to cancel that, but if my mouse is very close to the center and I hit the S key, it scales very quickly. And also, you'll notice that it can scale backwards. You see the color changing just slightly? What that means is my normal is getting reversed. And these things can be really tricky if you're not paying close attention. But you see the scale right here? This means it's its normal size. This is under the object data properties. So if I hit scale and I scale it up, you see those properties start to change there. But if I go backwards, you see those numbers turning negative. Normally you don't want a negative scale because it can reverse the normals depending on what you're doing. The normals are the direction that light hits off the planes of the objects. And it really doesn't matter too much when you're doing basic animation and stuff like that. But if you ever work with games, video games, then the direction that your normals point is really critical. Now what I want to do is subdivide this object. And you have lots of ways of subdividing. The simplest that I do is just subdivide the actual geometry. So what I'm going to do is switch from object mode to edit mode. And this allows me to edit the object that I currently have selected, edit the individual geometry. Then I select Tools, and then I come down here and I want to hit the Subdivide button. Where are you, Subdivide button? Subdivide. And what that does is it just splits up the polys. And I want to do it several times. You don't want to do it too much, but I split it up such that I now have 16,000 vertices and 16,000 faces. What that allows me to do is to go back into, edit mode and edit this into a landscape. So if I go into edit mode, I can select one of these vertices. If I hit the period key, it should zoom into that vertex. And if I use these arrows to move it, it'll just move it like that. What I want to do is something called proportional editing. So, and this is like soft select in Maya. And so while I'm in edit mode and I have that vertex selected, I want to turn on proportional editing. And currently the proportional editing is set for this soft mode. And so if I do that and I grab it, you can see that it's going to soft select those vertices. And the better way of doing this is to hit the G key. So if I hit the G key, you can see it's selected, but I don't have to hold anything. If I change the mouse wheel on my mouse, it changes the size of that soft select. as it's selected. If I want to make sure it's only going up and not sideways, I can hit the Z key and it locks it to the Z axis. And in Blender, by default, the Z axis is the up axis. And X is this axis, the red axis, and Y is the green axis. So in this way, I can create small hills, S, oops, not S, I meant G, move that up and down, and just create small hills and valleys. And I can select multiple by hitting Shift Select. So I'm hitting Shift Select and selecting multiple vertices, and I can hit G. I'll scroll this down. You can see I can create these other valleys. Another way of doing it, hit A to deselect. If I hit C for Circle Select, I can paint a selection like this. And then if I hit G, after I hit Escape, if I hit G and then Z, I can create valleys this way. So in this way, you can just create simple rises and falls of a landscape. There's other ways, many, many other ways, to procedurally generate landscapes. But when I'm starting to teach Blender, this is how I usually start for creating basic landscapes. Go back to object mode. You can see I've created just a really basic, simple landscape. What I want to do now is smooth that out. So with it selected in object mode, and the shortcut for object in edit mode is Tab. So if I hit Tab, 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 Tab. So when you're in object mode, that's just for selecting the object and moving the object around. But when you're in edit mode, that's for selecting the parts of the object and editing them. So I hit Smooth, and now the geometry is smooth. So I'm trying to set this up really quick and make this very basic. What I want to do now is add another plane and then start applying textures to this plane and using that texture to actually light the scene. So what I want to do is create another plane. So I'm going to hit Shift A, Mesh, Plane. So Shift A is the shortcut for add. It's the same thing as over here, but it allows me to get to that menu much faster. Shift A, Mesh, Plane. There's that first plane that's been created. And we can give it depth, but I'm trying to keep it really simple. I don't want it to have depth or anything like that. So it's just going to have 0 width. And then I want to rotate that on the x-axis. So remember, the red axis is the x-axis. You have several ways of rotating things. You can use the Rotate Widget tool right here, and then I can rotate it this way. Or I can just choose back to the normal widget, and I can just, I can just hit R for rotate, and then X to lock it to the x-axis, and I want to rotate it 90 degrees, so I just type in 90, and then I hit return, and then I know my changes are exact. I could also do the same thing if I open up the properties panel by hitting the N key, and I can change the properties for that object here. If I just type in 90 as opposed to 0, I can rotate objects that way, 90. So you got 100 ways to do the same thing. Dylan, you look like you're really sad because of this presentation.
You're not the first person to say this week.
Okay, we're all tired. People say that all the time. I want to like I don't know, do something violent when someone says, "You always look sad. You always have a frown." I'm like, "That's my face. It's just right that way." You don't say that like with a pug. You know, "You look so sad, pug." It's just how God made me. All right, so anyway, I'm going to scale this out into different ways to make it like a billboard horizontal size. So I apologize if I offended you, but when I'm talking and I'm trying to give a great presentation, I want all my students to look like they're enthralled by this great knowledge. So if you can at least fake it, that would help me. So I'm going to scale this down. So I want to hit S, Z, so it shrinks it down. You see how it's shrinking it down only on the Z axis? And then I hit S a little bit more, and then, so this will be my first billboard. I'm going to put that right here against this landscape, and then I'll just move it down so it's a little bit off the ground. Now we want to give this a material. So with it selected, I'll come over to Materials, and I hit New Material. And right now the material is set to be, and I'm splitting my view. The panel system in Blender is pretty cool, but for newcomers, it's also a nightmare. It's very versatile, but it's kind of weird. If I want 2 panels, I just grab these corners here and drag them out. And the direction you drag it is important, because if I drag it down, it splits it in that way. But if I want to join them, I just grab the panel that I want to keep, and I drag it over the panel I want to get rid of. and it just merges that way. And but usually what happens are students are like, I don't know what I did, and they just start creating all these different panels. But you have to know to merge it, you have to merge into an area that's the same direction. And every panel can be any panel. So this panel I want to be the node editor instead of just another 3D view. And again, this object, it needs a material, so I say, hey, create a material. And because I created a material and I had the node editor open, we see the nodes for that material. This is like the hypershader in Maya. And what we want here is to apply a new material or texture to this object. Ow, 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 ow. So if we want to start to see those textures live, we switch to the texture renderer here in this panel. And now what we want to do is add another type of texture. We want to add an image texture. So I grab that there. And now, before I go any further, I save the file before it starts to crash. Normally, Blender crashes, if Blender is going to crash, it crashes in two main places. When you apply a modifier to something that's too complex, when you try to render, or when you open a file, like an exterior texture file that you shouldn't have opened. So I always save before I get into any of those areas. So I want to open a texture, and I want to find a file here that I want to use to edit. So remember, there was gateways to the mind here. So these are big files, and I don't know how it's going to handle it. Probably what I should do instead is export individual clips, and I think that would be a safer way to go. Individual short clips that just repeat. So like if we come back here to gateways to the mind and we see some of these weird shots that I found. I like this where this guy just cuts in like that. I like that. So if I want to just export that little clip here, I can export that directly from the preview window in Premiere. So if I go to File, Export Media, and it's going to export it at its current resolution. So I think that's fine. So I'm just going to choose, don't panic when I do this. I'm going to do something that you've not seen before. I'm just going to match the source with the preset. So I'm going to choose, let's choose, it should be H.264. Come on, you can do it. This is a low resolution file, so I'm just going to match that resolution file. It's going to be the same thing. Then I'm going to give it an output name. And so I'm inside of Edit, and I'll call this new folder Shorties. And this will just be clip 1. Because it's only a few seconds, it'll export in just a couple seconds. No, not entire clip, just clip to in and out. There we go. So it's only 3 seconds long, and let's export. Ta-da. So now that shot is exported. We can come back to Blender, and Blender should be able to open MP4 files. Clip 4, open. And then what we want to do is tie the image color here to the color here. And when we see a video clip like this, we want to do a couple things to get that video clip correct. It knows that it's a movie. We want to match the movie's frame rates, and all should appear there. And then we want to make sure it shows up. So by plugging in the image to the color here, we should see the image here, unless it hasn't been unwrapped, and that might be what we need to do next. So I'm going to go into edit mode, I'm going to hit U and just choose Smart UV Project, unwrap it. There we go. So what that did was it just created the instructions on how to put the texture on the plane itself. And so now we see that image on the actual video file. And you won't see it play if I play it here. It's just not that powerful to do that, but it should play when we play it here. And in fact, we can also tell it to loop if we turn on cyclic right here. And if we turn on auto refresh, it should auto refresh that clip every time we move the playhead. And that's what it's doing. So I want to rotate this on the y-axis now another 90 degrees. One way of doing that, if I select it here, I look for the rotation here, y-axis 90 degrees. Now it's rotated. You can see the scale isn't quite right anymore. So I'm going to hit SX for scale, scale it out. Move it up. Now, I want this to be like a glowing billboard in the night. So instead of being a diffuse shader, which just means light bounces off of it, I want to change the shader to an emit object. So what I'm going to do in the node editor is I'm going to hit Shift A and add another shader, and that shader is going to be an emission shader. And so then what I want to do is disconnect the diffuse shader to the emission shader, and then reconnect the emission to the output of that object. It's not going to change anything here, but what it's going to do is have the effect of causing this to produce light from the emitter itself, from when we see the ray trace. So if I switch this view here from texture to actually rendered, it gives us a preview of the rendered object in that view. And you can see the light bouncing off of it a little bit right here. What I want to do is change my sky background to just night, so we see it all turn into night. And then you can see how light is bouncing off of that. And if I select the emission object right here, we can turn up the strength. So if we wanted it to be really bright, we can make it much brighter. See how that works? So this means I can take, and if I scrub the playhead, you will see the wheels moving because it's just looping that video over and over again. And that's how you put a video clip on a plane. Now, what do you think it'll look like on the other side? Will it be the video clip again? Yes. So if you wanted something separate, you would have to create a separate UV system for that, or we could turn this into a box instead of a plane. For the simple purpose of this example, I'm going to leave it like it is. But yeah, you could have a completely different image on the other side if you wanted to. So now my process is going to be very similar. I'm just going to create other clips that loop and show video, and then I'm just going to change the material to a different texture for each one. And this will show you the basic concepts of how Blender has different data objects that connect to each other. So right now, this texture or this material, which I'm going to call a tape machine, is connected to this object. And if I switch back to texture, we'll see that texture right there. And our ground has no texture right now, so I'll create a new ground for that. I'll just leave it white for the time being. I want another billboard, so I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate, then left click, and then I'll move it out. Just move it over here, and then I'd like to rotate it R on the Z axis, and I'll rotate it this direction. I'd like to zoom into it, so there it is. And now I'd like to put another material on that. So right now, tape machine is the material that's on this object. So what we want to do is duplicate tape machine. So I'll hit the plus button. And now it's called tape machine.001. And so if I create another clip, let's come back over to Premiere. We have a dog digging. So if I just wanted to use that clip, I've got 2 seconds identified there. I'm going to go to File, Export, Media. I'm just going to use H.264 and match the source, but also make sure I only export clip into out. And then I put it in the same direction. I'll just call this one dog. Export. Come back to Blender. And then making sure I have this new clip selected and that I've got tape machine. I'll rename tape machine dog. And then open that new texture, dog. And then before I go any further, I'm going to match the amount of frames in that clip. And I want to make sure it's cyclic and auto refresh. And so now we see the dog right there. And if we switch back to render, we see how that's looking. So we see the 2 clips producing light, and we can rotate around it. You can see what that looks like. And as we move the timeline, you'll see the dog and the tape machine move. I'm going to save it. So what you can see is I could add hundreds of clips, and then I can fly the camera around that scene. How should we fly the camera around that scene? There's several ways. One way would be to create a path that moves around it, and we tie the camera to that path. Another way would be to just individually keyframe the camera. That's the simpler way, and that's what I'm going to try now. So I'm going to switch back to texture. Now I want to see what the camera actually sees. So I'm going to switch this view back over to the 3D view. But I want this view to not have all these objects on it, so I'm just going to grab it and slide it over. And I want to see what the camera sees. So I've got several ways of doing that. The easiest way is to go to view. It's not the easiest, but it's a way you'll understand it. Cameras, I want to go and see through the active camera. This is what the active camera currently sees. If you want to get to a shortcut of that, I can just hit the big 0 on the number pad, like that. And now what I want to do is fly that camera around to get into a view. So with my mouse in this view, I'm going to hit Shift F, and Shift F sends us into fly mode. So you can see the camera moving around, and then I can use the WASD keys to just fly around like a video game. And then I can line up the camera for my first shot. I'll start right here. And so down here's my timeline. I'd like to start on this shot for the first 2 seconds of the video. So on frame 60, I'm going to create the first keyframe for the camera. So with the camera selected, make sure it's selected. I know it's selected because it's orange here and it's orange here. I'm going to set a keyframe for where the camera is at this point in time. And when you're creating any type of animation, it's a good idea to open up the dope sheet so you can start to see your keyframe. So I opened up a new panel here, and I opened up the dope sheet. So I'm going to hit I and choose Lock Rod, which means create a new keyframe for the location and rotation of the camera. So several things have to happen before I go into that point. I need to make sure the camera is where I want it at that point in time, that the camera is selected, and that my mouse is in the view of the 3D view. Then I hit the I shortcut key. I for insert keyframe and choose Lock Rod. So now my first keyframes are created. And then I'd like the camera to go somewhere else. So I'm going to move my timeline down several seconds and then move the camera to where I'd like it to be at that point in time. So I'd like it to be about out here, but I'd like it to turn this way at the same time. So I hit I, Lock Rod. And now if I play that back, play, we'll see the camera start to move, and now it reveals that. Does that make sense? If I want it to go slower, I can move these keyframes. So I can zoom in and out on the timeline, just like I do in the 3D view. And to select things, I right-click them, just like I do here. And then if I want to move these, I can use the G key for move. G, and then just move it over here, further down into the timeline. So now that animation takes more frames, and as a result, it takes longer to happen. And it reveals that animation there. If we want to add another keyframe in between here, so that way it points in a different direction, I can move the playhead into this point in time, and then hit Shift F and say, hey, over here, just keep pointing over here for the time being. How about right here? And I don't want to change its location, I just want to change its rotation. So I hit I and only add a keyframe for the rotation. So now if I play that back, you see how that changed the animation? Now I'd like, very slowly, to move the camera forward. Now, by default, Blender only has a 250 frame movie. You can see that here. You can change that here, or you can change it in the render properties. So if you want the end frame to not be frame 250, rather be 500, I can just type in 500. Then I can zoom out on the timeline. You can see I have now 500 frames in this movie. These yellow lines in the timeline just tell you that your current object that you have selected has keyframes. You can't move the keyframes, you can't do anything in the timeline with keyframes. It just tells you that the current object, which is the camera, does have keyframes set at that point in time. So it's just useful for that. But to actually move the keyframes around, you have to use either the dope sheet or the actual curve editor. So these, like the curve editor in After Effects, this exists here in the graph editor. And so then we can actually see the curves for the camera right here. And you can see the smooth motions that are automatically created for you. It's easier to edit the timeline, though, if you're just moving keyframes around with the dope sheet. So now I'd like to just have a slow zoom in on the dog digging. And somebody, the French, will apply meaning to it. Like, ooh, what does it mean? He's showing a dog digging. So if I hit Shift F and hit W to move forward, at this point in time, we'll just zoom in really far, and then I don't want to zoom in that far. So Shift F, so now, there we go. Then I hit I, lock her up. And if I hit play, let's go ahead and show textures in this view. Play. We see, and when we hit play, the animation on the videos won't happen. It just can't calculate that. Then we stop here and start to zoom in on the dog. Okay, now if I switch this view to rendered, we'll get an idea of what the actual animation will look like after it renders. If we try to hit play, it'll try to do it, but it won't be able to be real time, and it looks very gnarly. But it does give you a rough estimation of what the actual finished rendered look will be. So after that's rendered, we can do a little bit more with it. Blender has a really powerful compositor, and something that I really like that adds lens qualities to your work. So what I'm going to do now is split this view here and change this again to the node editor. And I'm going to render one frame of this. So I'm just going to come over here and make sure I hit render, and you can see it's rendering one frame of this animation. Okay, what I'd like in this animation is like a glare or something like that. So now that that one animation is there, it's in the system memory, or not animation, but one frame is there, it's in the system memory. So what I'm going to do is come over here, and instead of editing material nodes, I want to edit compositing nodes. That's right here. And I want to use nodes. I don't know why that button's there, because if you're here, you're obviously going to use nodes. Not always, there's other things that you can do. And then I also want to have a backdrop, which shows me the changes that I'm making as I see them. So I'm going to zoom in using the mouse wheel, and I'm going to go to add layout. I'm going to add a reroute switch. I'm going to plug that guy in right there. And then I want to go to add output viewer and plug that in here. And that allows us to actually see our composite in the background of this node editor. And I want to actually make it fit, so I'm going to hit fit, so that way it fits in there. And then I'm going to add some special effects. I'm going to go to add, filter, let's add a glare. You can start to see what that glare is doing. If we turn down the threshold, that means it's going to be more sensitive to what's actually happening. And I don't like the streaks glare, I want to add the fog glow glare. So you can see it's adding a fog glow sort of glare to the scene. And if we make that high quality, you can see that's what it tends to look like. So adding these atmospheric effects can make your animation and render seem much more real, or give it space. Now I want to add another distortion. So I'm going to add distortion, and my favorite thing is lens distortion. I'm going to add that after the glare. And it could go before, but that's fine. And then I want to turn on projector and then turn up dispersion. So if you see dispersion right there, what that does is it just makes lens artifacts that make it look like it's coming through a lens. So in other words, we're making the render much less perfect. So I'm going to turn up my render resolution up to 100% here in the render panel. And then I'm going to change the display from image editor to new window. So that way when I hit render, it pops open a new screen. I hit save. Let's go to a different frame. How about right here when it's further out? And I hit the render button. It should open up a new large window. It'll look very compressed because we're using very compressed video from archive.org. And so up here in the top left, you can see that it says we're rendering currently frame 235. The last frame that we rendered took 17 seconds. So far, this frame has taken 23 seconds. It predicts that there's still a minute left on this frame, how much RAM it's using, and so forth and so on. And from this, you can extrapolate how long your total render will take, and start to get an idea how long this process is. So these aren't terribly fast machines, and if you're rendering with the processors are only 4 core, so it can take a little bit of time. And so after it actually composites or renders the actual polys and all the textures, then it will apply the post-compositing filters and so forth. And so then it applies the composite, and there you see it with the glare and the lens dispersion. But I think this is pretty boring, so I'd like to make it like more vapor wavy. So I'm going to switch this node editor back to the 3D view. And I guess we have too many 3D views, so I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger. What I'd like to add now is some fun effects to the landscape. And so I'm making this up as I go. But what I'd like to add to this is I'd like to duplicate it and add a wireframe to it. So I'm just going to hit Shift-D on the landscape and then left-click. Normally this is not something you should do, but then what I want to do is go to modifiers, which are like filters and things like that. I want to go to Add Modifier, and I want to add a wireframe. So it's going to add a wireframe to my landscape. You can see what it's doing right there. But I want that wireframe to be much thinner. So I'm just going to turn it down. So it's very, very thin. Let's try making it 0.01. That's not nearly thin enough. 0.001. There we go. So that way we just get like a wireframe mesh on top of the landscape. Then what I'd like to do is under materials, I want to get rid of the gray on that grid and give it a new material. So I'm going to hit new. And instead of diffuse, I want to make it emission. And if we look at our node editor, let's come over to our node editor. Here's our emission object. And instead of being white, let's make it hot pink because it's vaporwave. Right? And we can turn down the brightness so it's not as intense, 0.5. Maybe 0.3. There we go. And I can come back to the modifier and maybe make it even thinner. Let's make it 0.00, come on little guy, 0.005. So that way that neon grid is much more subtle. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And then I can come back over to the compositor and I can like, let's just make this thing really insane. Let's turn backdrop back on. And because it is vaporwave, let's go back to add filter, and let's go back and add another glare into that line here. And let's make it streaks, but instead, let's just make it really insane. So you see how it's really blowing it out there? That's great. How many streaks do we want? Let's make 4. Change the fade so you can see what that looks like. Come on, render it, render it, render it, render it. There we go. It's insane. Let's turn it down. It's like Xanadu. All right. And the threshold, if we turn that threshold down on that, it's going to be even brighter. Come on. You can see it compositing up there. So there we go. So now let's render that scene. Again, make it a habit. Command S, save, render. And if you see any noise in your render, like we see here, especially if you're doing offset lighting like we're doing, or emission object lighting, your scene will be a lot noisier. And so we want to make sure that we turn up the sampling so that way it looks a little bit cleaner. So you can see what that's looking like. I'm going to hit escape. And I do see quite a lot of noise here, and so I'd like to clean that up a little bit. So I'm going to hit escape to cancel the render, hit escape again to get rid of that view, and then under the render panel, I want to crank up the samples. So come down here to samples, where are you? Sampling. And then under the render, I'm going to crank that up to say maybe 400. What that'll have the effect of is making your animation much, much slower. But the more you turn up the samples, the less noise you have. So it's always a compromise there. But also, you see this little timeline or clock right here? This is really important because when you do have noise in the scene like we have here, that noise will look exactly the same from frame to frame, which makes it look really bizarre. So if we turn on that clock right there, it recalculates the noise for every frame. I know that sounds weird and it doesn't make any sense because there's nothing to relate to it. But what that means is it'll just look more natural and it'll look like film grain as you animate it. So that should be on by default, but it's not. And so you want to turn that on. It used to be we had to animate that manually, but not anymore. So I hit save. Now what if I want to make an animation from this? What we do is we set up an output. So I come over here, and it's always better to output a frame sequence rather than a QuickTime, but you can export a QuickTime if you want. And then I come over to my documents. I'm putting it in a folder called Edit, and I'll make a new folder. This is the new folder button, and I'll call that new folder Vapor. Select that, and hit Accept. And so every frame will just be called 0001, 0002, 0003, so forth and so on. And it's going to be rendering frame 1 through 500. It's going to render every frame, not skip over frames. It's going to put it in that folder. It's going to render PNG files that are 8-bit with an alpha channel, if there's any alpha included. And when we have all those settings like the way we want them, we hit Animation. And then the process begins. So it's rendering frame 1 of 500, and this is how long it's going to take. So normally what I would do is I would just come back tomorrow. And if you're rendering on these machines, you can just select your name up here and choose Login Window. And most people are just using Illustrator or Photoshop, and they shouldn't notice that your computer is rendering for you in the background. If you have a Google Drive or like a OneDrive, what we can do is we can point the rendered folder to those Google Drives, and that way it'll upload in the background, and you can check on it on your phone, see how your render's going. And that's a thing that I like to do. But also you can use that method to have multiple computers rendering to the same Google Drive, and they'll just hopscotch over each other if you change your settings to this setting over here. If you turn off overwrite and turn on placeholders, what that does is if it detects that an image file is already there, it skips over it. And if placeholders is turned on, it'll create a blank file while it's working on it. So what that does is each computer is like, I got this file, and the next computer says, okay, I got the next one, I got the next one, and then they leapfrog over each other until they're done. And if you got 30 computers all doing that at the same time, that usually exponentiates your render time, and it works really, really well. So frame 1 is still rendering, but you can see where it's going. It's gloriously from the 80s. And that's the basics of setting up textures, setting up some basic models. And I went pretty fast, but I recorded the whole thing, so you can go at your own pace from there. Questions? All right, thank you. Let's let that one frame render, and then I'll stop the recording. And I do find using a Wacom tablet to use Blender, you have to set up the settings right, but it's actually, I'm using a mouse right now, but it's actually better on your hands. It'll keep you from getting carpal tunnel. To use a pen and a drawing tablet to navigate and move around on the computer, the mouse is using too many of the wrong fingers. And so I brought my Wacom tablet, but I'm still slow using it to use Blender, so I use the mouse to be fast. But it's healthier to use a drawing tablet to navigate and to do your work instead of a mouse. It's a more natural form for your hands. But I'm having like a lot of pain in my arm just using the mouse these days, and I need to work on becoming ambidextrous. But like Professor Friesen says, there are some health hazards for being a graphic designer. I become short-sighted and closed-minded. No, and I get tennis elbow and sleep deprivation. So if I move this over to say like my Alienware machine with the fast GPU, it'll render in about a quarter of the time, and it'll be much faster. So I'll show you that in a moment. And so now we'll see the glare. Oh, so glary. Okay. Thank you.